Hey, IT changemakers, and welcome to The Deck Show with Tom McGraw. Let's get into it.
Hello, changemakers. So, we've now spent as an industry over a decade moving everything to the cloud that we can. At the same time, we've seen digital employee experience become a real priority for organizations. And now, layered on top of this complicated picture, we've got a huge wave of AI investment and AI expectations. Um, but across the first and third in particular, there is a similar question that haunts all of this transformation, which is this: is everybody getting the value they expected? It's a big question. It's an almost ubiquitous question. You encounter it a lot at the moment. And we're very, very happy today to have a guest who's been at the center of the cloud conversation more generally for decades, and I think can give us some really interesting answers. David Linthicum, welcome to the show. For those unfamiliar with your work, please introduce yourself for us.
Yeah, Dave Linthicum. I'm an AI architect and cloud architect by trade. My latest gig, I was Chief Cloud Strategy Officer at Deloitte for about 8 or 9 years, and prior to that, I was CTO of several consulting firms and technology firms, and just kind of had a long career. Right now, I'm an independent analyst slash influencer. I got some YouTube stuff going on, podcast stuff going on, and wrote 17 books, including my latest two, Unlocking the Power of Cloud and An Insider's Guide to Cloud Computing, just published a couple of years ago.
Quite the bibliography there, David. Congratulations. And, as you just framed it yourself, you've had really a front row seat to the cloud for a long time now. And I was curious to begin with maybe an unorthodox question, which is how your own relationship to that technology has evolved during that period. Has there been perhaps a feeling of disenchantment, or were you indeed like always have a very pragmatic and realistic outlook to the cloud and what could be done rather than the sort of idealistic one per se?
Yeah, I jumped into it in the 90s, actually. Wrote a business plan for a company called Project Archangel, which was providing infrastructure, storage, compute, and integration stuff as a service. Couldn't get anybody interested in it. And then I was working for a company at Software AG at the time, then worked for a company called Mercator, and then left after Mercator was sold to IBM to go work for Grand Central, which was probably one of the first cloud companies out there, early days, no longer around. And really tried to innovate in the fact that I think that we have something here. If we're able to share infrastructure, we should be able to use it in cheaper, more reliable ways. And now that we have the internet, we have the ability to do that. And so that was always the focus. So software as a service, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service. And grew up that whole era. And when cloud finally took off in 2009, when I wrote my first cloud book, I saw a lot of promise in our ability to make this stuff scale. There was 30 cloud companies out there at the time, believe it or not. Every telecom company had a cloud company. Rackspace was not a managed service provider; they were a cloud company. And I thought it was a true shift in terms of how we're going to leverage compute systems moving forward. As I worked through that, I understood there were some realities that people needed to understand. Number one, not every workload or data set should be moved to the cloud. We're going to have to look at the data set where they're going to be optimized and best use. And moving forward, it was basically looking at the realities behind cloud computing in terms of the value that it's going to bring back to the enterprise. Current the time, the thinking, the hype was driving everything. Everybody was moving to the cloud. Gartner had said that 80% of the people are going to be in the cloud in 1 year, and everybody's making these bold predictions. And I didn't see it happening. It's too expensive. Enterprises can't move that fast. And moving forward, I just thought there were some limitations that people should be aware of. And so what I started to do is started to take some realistic takes on it. I was writing in still do the cloud blog on InfoWorld, and started writing about the value viability and the business viability of the technology. So it has to earn its own keep. And I realized at the time people were lifting and shifting thousands of applications and thousands of data sets in the cloud. And in many cases, the running on those things was 2 to 3 times the cost of running it on prem. I said, well, that wasn't supposed to happen. We were supposed to get a significant discount and had reliability and, CapEx versus OpEx stuff. But that was the case. And as we normalized the industry, we got down to basically three cloud providers, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. I didn't see the prices going down. I didn't see additional stabilization. In fact, if anything, I saw the prices going up. So we had, kind of the joining of companies making, I think, bad architectural decisions without having understanding the value of cloud. In other words, moving workloads and data sets to the cloud that really didn't belong there. And then the cloud providers not necessarily getting to good value in terms of the services they're able to provide. And that was a recipe for disaster. And so suddenly here we are in 2026, we have maybe 40 to 50% of workloads that have migrated to the cloud or migrated to software as a service systems. Many of them are not returning value back to the business. In fact, they're removing value from the business. And that's why we're seeing the repatriations that are going now. And also the acceptance is that necessary public cloud is going to be the ultimate destination like it was 10 years ago. It's an architectural option. We can still use on-prem systems, which are enormously cheap, even though hardware is going up in price. They're still a cheaper alternative. Managed service providers, co-location providers, other alternatives beside the public cloud, and allow you to, in essence, get to a better place with the technology that you're looking to leverage. And now we're into the AI era. Everybody's looking to inflect, you can consume GPUs. Cloud's definitely on the table, and kind of it's the easy button for AI, but still 2, 3 times more expensive than on-prem alternatives. And companies are really kind of making these core decisions now. So I'm focused on that. I'm focused on educating people as to what the value is, where the value is not, and looking at this technology with a bit of a skeptical bent, not necessarily anti-cloud, but understanding where it's going to work in areas of the business where it shouldn't be. And I think that's, something that's typically not said. And, it's very much still a cloud computing world. There's a narrative out there that cloud is the way to go. Always move to the cloud only, cloud first, all that kind of stuff. And I've been pushing back against it, but really kind of from a pragmatic architectural bent, not from just kind of a contrarian bent. In other words, I'm pushing back on it if I have data to back it up. Here's why we're doing this.
So I'm going to pick up on one of the issues you kind of mentioned in passing, which is, and ask you, why are companies still struggling so much to answer the basic question of what value they're actually getting from cloud and SaaS apps in particular?
I think it's a couple of things. Number one, it's really not known how to do that. Now, we haven't had a growth of a discipline called FinOps. In other words, cloud FinOps, financial operations, the ability to determine what this stuff is actually costing us. But very few enterprises out there are active in the FinOps organization. So they're getting their information from two places. Number one, the public cloud providers, which have, $20 billion of marketing that they're spending out in the space that are obviously spinning everybody to using the public cloud providers. And also from the consulting firms. And of course, I come from that world as well, who are incentivized to move them into the cloud because they obviously make money from change. They also get fees from the public cloud providers, which, by the way, they're partnered with. And so listening it from both sides, you have some very smart people with very strong personalities that are showing up in the executive conference rooms that are leading them down that path without looking at the realities of it. And so, in other words, very much is like an oversimplification of everything. They're telling them to move to the cloud without an understanding of what they're moving, what the business objectives are, and not necessarily doing the architectural work to make it happen. Some are, most are not. And so it's very easy to go along to get along. In other words, at the end state, all your stuff is going to work. Your applications running on the cloud are going to work perfectly fine. You're just going to pay 3 times as much for them. So there's not this immediate pushback of things failing and the business not working. And so they're making decisions that are financially irresponsible, I think, without looking at the details and not doing the hard work that it takes to make it happen. I'm talking about both sides. The public cloud providers are doing that because obviously they're selling something. Their interest is in to get your workloads and get your data sets into the cloud. And then the consulting firms, which are obviously promoting change, and they're complicit in this as well. So we're not getting the objective third parties out there that are talking about this in ways that I've been talking about this. And so it's a very unique time that we live in. And now we're looking at AI. AI applications are 10 to 20 times more expensive than the traditional applications that they would mimic. And in doing so, we have a big decision to make. Are we going to run that stuff in the cloud and pay 3 times as much? Are we going to run it on prem, and pay a discount? Are we going to run it in somewhere in between? And I think it's a tough question. And quite frankly, when you're in the room, you become the designated buzzkill. Raise your hand and go, hey, shouldn't we really kind of figure out the business case and the value, whether this platform should be right or not? And I got the public cloud providers on one side and the consultants on the other. I do this for a living now. And they really don't want to hear it because it puts kind of noise against many of their decisions or where they're looking to go. The public cloud providers obviously want the business, so they don't want to talk about other alternatives. And the consulting firms get a fee, from the public cloud provider, so they don't want to do it either. So you're kind of shouted down ultimately based on the number of folks that are out there. I mean, 150,000 people go to reInvent. The Google Next is happening this week. There'll be many tens of thousands of people there. They're all cheerleading parties for the cloud, and it's very tough to get above those noise.
So I mentioned AI. If it gives us a deeper visibility into how employees are actually interacting with their technology, does that present the opportunity to tie cloud and SaaS investments more closely to productivity and I guess experience as well?
Yeah, it should. Getting to the architectural realities and how much value is going to come back from these things in terms of how employees and other functional entities, machines in the company are going to work, with these technologies. So everything is tied back to the value that comes back to the business. Now, and it's very weird. It's multidimensional. I can write a system or basically move to a platform that's going to save me money. However, it may become less of value if it doesn't provide the agility, if it doesn't provide the scalability that I need. So we always have to look at how it's going to come back to running the core business processes, dealing with the humans, dealing with the customers. And I always look at that as really kind of the architecture of it. When I build a system, I start with the architecture. And then move to the solution. I don't take the solution and move back to I start with the business and move to the architecture. I don't start with the architecture and move to the business. And it's getting those sorts of things where you're considering how this affects everybody in the organization, including the executives, the employees, and the consultants, and the customers. And that's something I think that people are missing right now.
And this is another sort of hot topic at the moment, David. Should vendors start to be held more accountable for outcomes rather than consumption? What's your view on the, I guess, SaaS apocalypse, as it's sometimes going as?
Yes, vendors should be held accountable, but they're typically not. And normally, if you read the agreements that you're signing, they're not responsible for any kind of misuse or misvalue of using their technology. But it's concerning to me that we see some of the value being removed from the business by using this particular cloud providers, cloud vendors, SaaS providers, infrastructure as a service providers, and there doesn't seem to be accountability. In other words, if I, look at somebody and I say, "Well, it looks like you've lost $10 million by using this technology over the last 3 years. Why are we not considering alternative technologies moving forward if we know that to be an issue?" And sometimes they do listen to reason. For the majority of times, they're looking at the devil they know. They're going to work with the technologies. The money doesn't necessarily seem to be, it's an issue. If you find it, they're like, "Hey, there you go, Dave. You figured it out." But you're not having any kind of recourse or course correcting. Very little, very few. And the cloud providers, quite frankly, aren't held accountable because they're part of the narrative out there. They're supposed to be the solution. And so people often don't question what their role is. And I think that's really dangerous because they're allowed to work in perpetuity, charge whatever they want, and not necessarily provide reliable infrastructure to take some of these businesses forward. So it's asking the tough questions that I think people don't want to ask and getting to some of the answers that need to be there. Good news is more people are listening to reason now. They're hiring me to audit their projects. They're, talking about, putting in, FinOps, Cloud FinOps kind of arrangements to figure out where the value is going to be. And they're doing some of the deep architectural choices to make it happen. But those are still few and far between versus everybody else is making a knee-jerk reaction to move to the cloud and kind of hoping for the best.
You've articulated it brilliantly how AI presents a new potential for effectively massive waste, but also does the technology provide somewhat paradoxically with greater means for us to scrutinize value, whether it's of AI apps or cloud usage? Like, does the technology allow us to identify, for instance, outcomes over consumption better?
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the AI augmented FinOps tools out there are brilliant. They just work extremely well. And it's able to get to the core patterns and what's leading up to value. You got to remember again, value is a multidimensional thing. It's not just saving money. It's the ability to operate the business in a more optimized way, and the ability to, impress the customers so we grow the customer base, the ability to provide better systems for the employees so we're able to maintain the employees that are going to be there. And it's looking at all aspects of this. And so if you have a model that's trained in not only the information or the consumption of the cloud resources, say over the past 10 years, where the business is going, what the objectives are, you're more likely to get to a series of corrective actions that are going to get to where you need to be. It's never going to be, the answer is five. It's always going to be a plan and how you're going to implement it, how to make these incremental improvements. And AI is a great weapon to make that happen. Don't overuse it, and don't put it into everything. You human beings still have to make the decision. But if some of these LLMs, I use them all the time, and in my architecture stuff, they're able to lead us into better ways, but they're able to consider massive amounts of data that I can't consider as a human, and therefore use it as a tool, use it to augment your decisions. Don't allow it to make your decisions, and it's absolutely brilliant.
Amazing. And let's focus in on AI itself and as a potential source of waste or value. Um, you've already painted this picture of organizations under massive pressure, a lot of it kind of financially motivated to transform. But can these organizations, or should they be able to better articulate what the ROI is specifically for AI investments, and what should they do to be better able to if they can't?
I think it's got to be down to a margin of error plus or minus 5%, which is something we haven't hit before. Because if we're going to spend this amount of money, in many cases, it's going to be billions and billions of dollars for some of the global 2000 companies out there. And if I'm sitting on a board, I'm damn well going to want to know how that money is going to come back to me in terms of ROI, and when it's going to come back to me in terms of ROI. And this just going for the technology's sake is something they're not going to accept when you're looking at 20 times the cost. So the cost of these AI systems is so cost prohibitive that we have to pick the right battles to win the war, and the ability to look at the incremental improvements we're going to make, the systems we're going to put in, and how we're going to back that into value that's going to back it into additional profits, additional customer loyalty, something that we can turn into revenue. Now, AI can be a great force multiplier for many businesses out there. I think we're going to have some breakout companies in the next 5 years where AI really was their catalyst to take them to the next level, a la, Netflix and Uber, things like that. But in doing so, we can't invest in everything, and you have to figure out where the investments are going to be made in priority order. And the only way to do that is to figure out the value. So, my guidance to everybody is to have a financial viability model done when you're looking at this stuff, figuring out and estimating where the value is going to come in, look at the risk of not having the value, and that has an incremental cost unto itself, and then getting to a number you're able to commit to. Now, one of the things I do, it's pretty scary, walk into a boardroom and say, well, listen, look, we can generate $20 million in value over the next few years if we move to this particular system. And here's how I found out. I'll show my work. This would be, customer retention that leads into additional sales based on the demographics, the ability to have logistics systems that are able to, optimize the ability to get the raw material goods to the manufacturing facility, yada, 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 whatever it is that your business is able to do. But I can put it back to a number that they're likely to see. I don't think we're doing that now. People will just say that's where the value is going to be. It's such agile. They paint things in very simplistic terms. I think it's the details that matter. And certainly when you're dealing with AI, when you're dealing with 10 to 20 times the cost, you're going to put yourself out of business fairly quickly if you don't pick the right battles.
Do you think there's a sense, David, in which what you're describing, which is transformation, not delivering the dividends organizations expect from it, nonetheless becomes just part of the movement of our technological economy? Do you know what I mean? Like, just because individual companies are rewarded by that, it still becomes an inevitable necessity for them all. I was just wondering what your reflection is on that tension between individual organizational expectations and just the general direction of travel in terms of our infrastructures and such like, and whether it's possible to hang back in any meaningful way if everybody else is surging forward towards what might be unrealizable goals.
Yeah, that's the pressure, right? I mean, go to Google Next this week and just get, which is now an agentic AI show, and just have cheerleaders for 3 days or 4 days on agentic AI and the use of the Google infrastructure and reInvent and Microsoft Ignite. And it's very difficult to say something that's contrary to those sorts of things and saying, "Where my business is special, I need to hang back." And moving forward too quickly, I think, is going to cause issues because we don't have the right funding to get us to the right point of value, and therefore I'm concerned about moving ahead now. Those are decisions, however, that adults make. And you got to be you're if you're an executive at a company, I've been an executive many times, you have a responsibility to maximize the return of investment back to the shareholders. And obviously the shareholders are the employees and you and lots of folks out there. So making those decisions that are financially responsible becomes an imperative, even the ones that don't feel right. In other words, you're going to make some unpopular decisions that kind of goes against the narrative, goes against the grain. And I think that's what courageous, executives need to do. The ones out there who know how to make these decisions, typically they're the ones that are going to be, the most have the most success. But having the fortitude and having the ability to take a detailed look at this stuff and get to the right answers where the risk is going to be lowered as much as possible as you're making a mistake is going to be a much better path to do it. I understand you're going to get criticism from it. I remember my days as a CTO. I would get pressure to move to something like XML back in the days. And I would make a decision not to do it because there's no value there for the technology. I was going to have to spend $10 million to put a feature in something that would actually make the technology worse. But the pressure was to make it happen. I pushed back on that. I took a lot of grief and arrows for that, but ultimately it was the right decision. And I think people need to get some courage and, make some of these things with technology because right now the bets are getting to a point where you're going to kill the business.
Wow, interesting. How do you think, conversely, organizations are approaching the question of AI ROI? You've already said it's vague, would be my paraphrase of what you sort of sketched out. But I mean, what use cases, expectations, or measurements do they have stipulated for what they would consider success presently?
I don't think they do. I think that I'm just seeing a bunch of confusion out there. I was with a bunch of CIOs last week, at a conference, and they don't know how to articulate or understand what the use cases that they need to pick for the ROI. They know that AI is important, and they're letting it grow within the organization now, typically around edge use cases. In other words, they're giving it to their employees to automate their calendars and automate email responses and do some CRM based stuff tied to Salesforce, things like that. But as far as what's core to the business, what's going to actually change the business, inventory management, logistics management, sales order entry, things like that, that are fundamental to the way the business operates, they don't know how to attack that yet. And that's a fundamental confusion. And by the way, that's why we're seeing people picking the wrong use cases. I mean, the MIT study from 6 months ago, and we've seen other studies that are aligning up with that. 95% of, AI projects out there tank. They don't return ROI. People picking the wrong use cases. People don't understand how much money and time has to be spent on it. They're not necessarily aligning the correct technologies. They're overusing AI in many cases. In other words, it shouldn't be used. They are. It's costing 20 times as much and they're still failing. So all of that confusion is out there very much more than it was in the cloud. In the cloud, we're basically moving to the same infrastructure, but it was replicated as a service with a cloud provider. With the AI system, there's, five factorial of decisions you need to make in terms of what use cases, what business cases need to be addressed, how deeply you need to use AI, what AI models, where it's agentic or prompt based. All these sorts of things are in line. And to be honest with you, I think most enterprises haven't, started that journey yet. In fact, the complaints I hear from the technology providers out there is that they haven't. What do we do to make them move forward? What do we do to, get them beyond simple use of LLM, chat GPT to write letters to their grandma or things like that. And the reality is, you got to get some smart people in there who have some good architectural knowledge to figure out what your business realities are, what you can conceivably do with the technology we have today, and put together a plan to move forward. Those plans typically don't exist. I meet a lot of chief AI officers, and of course, they were chief cloud officers 2 years ago. They just made the change. Everybody's AI washing the resumes these days. And they don't seem to have a clue as to how to do this. And there doesn't seem to be as many people who are seeking advice on how to make it happen. Now, I have the most watched agentic AI architecture course, in the world right now, cool for me. But I would like to see that turn into, basically the lessons I teach in that course turn into actions where the companies are moving in the correct directions. Holistically, that's not happening. I'm sure in some micro instances, they're going to show me where there is some progress made and they are making many of the good decisions. Those are few and far between. And so we're at a point right now, we know AI is important. We don't know what it's supposed to be used for our particular purposes. We don't understand the use cases and we don't understand the ROI, but go AI. That's where we are. And you see that cartoon, what do we want? AI. When do you want it now? What are you going to use it for? We don't know. And that's exactly the world today.
And is that a direct parallel with where cloud was, say, 10 years ago? Is that where you draw the parallel specifically in terms of the stage of transformation and the perspective that could save you money in the future?
Yeah, it probably more like 13 years ago. We're at the same sort of a inflection point, and there's more on the line with this. So, making a mistake in the cloud, it's going to cost you some additional money, but it's not going to kill you. You're going to have your CFO mad at you because you're spending too much money on the cloud when you told them they were going to reduce money, not increase money spent. The AI stuff is very much making the same types of decisions where we're looking at the advantages of some technologies in front of us that we feel compelled to use or compelled to look at, and not necessarily coming to grips with the realities of what that technology can do for us and the value can be that it's able to bring back. And I saw many people, probably 70% of the organizations, made lift and shift decisions, taking massive amounts of applications and data and moving it into the cloud without an understanding as the rhyme and reason of doing so, and never having any kind of concern about the ROI that's coming back. They just felt it was the right thing to do, and people congratulated them for making the move. And they got to speak at reInvent, and they got to speak to the board of directors and how amazing that this cloud migration went. I was working on a lot of them at the time. However, what you don't see is 3 years later when they're looking at the value and the value's not there. I think we're going to go through the same thing with AI. I think ultimately people are going to make some tactical decisions how to using this technology, probably with the wrong frameworks, the wrong understanding, and getting the wrong advice. And they're going to find that many of the mistakes in 2 to 4 years are going to come back as value are being removed from the business. And if that's the case, they're going to have to either take corrective action or do what most people did with the cloud. They just didn't talk about it. And it went on for 10 years until finally the CFO put his foot down and say, hey, listen, look, move to something else beside AWS because this is killing us. And I think the same sort of mistakes are happening in slow motion right now.
Let's unpack in a little bit more detail then what good AI ROI might look like in practice. And David, what concretely should leaders be measuring? And how much of a challenge is visibility when trying to answer those kind of questions and find those kind of measurements?
Yeah, it should come back as business value, but let me explain what that is. And so, in other words, what's important to us that's going to bring more um, value back to the business, whether it's revenue, increased valuation, whatever. And typically it's related to how we serve a customer. And so if I'm selling cars, my ability to serve the customer in ways that are far advanced as to what my competitors are doing, or if I'm running a pharmaceuticals company or selling carpets, your ability to automate that process in such a way where it's absolutely going to delight the market and provide some key advantages that your competitors don't have. And it's really getting at that with AI. So, in other words, if with the addition of AI, how can I delight my customers? How can I optimize my supply chain? All the little friction points they have within a business. How am I able to do this extremely much better than I could without AI? And what are the fundamental things that need to change to make it happen? Businesses need to look at that. So I'm hearing about things in terms of the edge use cases and analytical stuff and things like that. But it's what your business does. If you're manufacturing something, how you can use AI to optimize that process, supply chain integration, raw material, goods sourcing, things, and manufacturing optimization. How can you deal with logistics and how you can deal with a customer interface in ways that are going to improve your business? And so I would look at it that way. Now if we figure out those ways to improve the business, then I can figure out the metrics and figure out how much value is going to come back to the business and say, look to a 5 to 10 year horizon. But it's those sorts of things where the questions need to be answered before we start moving into technology, where the enterprises are quite confused as to what it is. When I used to talk about agility in terms of a value of cloud computing, which is definitely there, and scalability is really kind of an aspect of agility, no one knew what the hell that meant. They knew it's important, but if you're talking to a company that over the next 10 years, they plan on acquiring 5 more companies to add to their portfolio, then the cloud is going to have some value because you're able to shift those systems fairly quickly because cloud is something you're outsourcing your infrastructure, something else, somebody else is running, and you can do so through configuration. And therefore, that's where the value is going to be delivered. We're making those assumptions as to the cloud having value, the value is delivered, and you're going to make that happen. Same thing with AI, but there's much more at risk. So, in other words, we're trying to move in a direction that's going to provide us, a business advantage, and then figuring out what the advantage is, and then figuring out how much money we can make and how much valuable we can make and how better of a company we can be, even if some of the ethical stuff around it as well. And those are way tougher questions to answer. That's where you get into architecture. That's where you can get into business analytics and some of these things that we really should be thinking about now. You got to remember, architects stand between the business and the technology, and they're the ones who are on the hook to make the right decisions. Whether those are architects that work for a consulting company or work within the organizations, leave the hype back. Figure out what you need to do with this. Figure out the core advantages it's going to have. Put them in priority order. Figure out how much money you can spend realistically over time. Enterprises typically can't move that fast because of the money limitations, and then move forward with that. And that's something that we don't seem to be as interested in now, but I think it's something we should be interested in now.
Dave, it's been such a privilege talking to you. And one thing I've always noticed in your work is you're a kind of crusader against hype. You know, that's how I've always thought of you.
Designated buzzkill is what they normally call me.
Designated buzzkill, amazing. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions just to finish off about the nature of hype, and at which point do you see hype in our economy, in our sort of evolution, technological evolution, as useful? It clearly drives adoption, right? But it also leads to a lot of bad decisions. What's the right balance here? And does hype play an important role in things in general? Should we give hype some credit, David?
Yeah, I think we should because it gets people interested in change. In other words, if they see something in front of them, they view it as value. Obviously, the hype is generated from the marketing stuff that comes from the technology providers now. It doesn't come from the press anymore, the tech press. It comes from the technology providers, which basically drive much of the messaging in the tech press. So, in doing so, they're open to change because of the hype. They know there's something out there they should be looking at. They don't know exactly what it is. AI is, of course, the best instance of that now, and it gets people to reconsider altering their technology solution to get to a better, more optimized state. And that's what hype is good at. Hype can also be confusing and lead them in the wrong direction, but it gets people, out of the office to the conferences, to have these discussions to learn more about what some of the opportunities are. Now they also have opportunities to make mistakes, but I think there's something to be said about, pushing action, and hype pushes action. People feel like there's a party going on and we're left out if we're not, a part of the hype train. And people have a tendency not to want to go against the narratives. They're not going to stand up in meetings now and push back on AI. That's obviously could be a career killer in some organizations. They're going to go along to get along because they're following the hype because they view that's where the zeitgeist is and that's where their success is going to be. And I understand it, by the way. I tell my students all the time, you can disagree one time. Don't make a habit of it. Don't be the designated curmudgeon, because at the end of the day, people are going to expect you to have a positive look in terms of where this technology is going and not necessarily push back on each piece of it. So you have to kind of play the game if you're in the enterprise. I don't anymore because I'm retired. I've kind of gotten out of the shooting range of most of the people I worked for in the past. But you have to keep a positive view in terms of where the technology is going, where the hype is going, and be able to explain it, but also be able to make the adult decisions as to whether or not you should use it or not. And so I always tell people have a positive look on any technology, cloud AI, things like that. Don't push back on any of it until you understand how it's going to be used because you don't know it's whether or not it's a solution for you or not. You just know it's there. And then make sure that you make an adult decision as to whether or not we should be used. And if you're pushing back on some of the stuff, make sure you have the data that instructs people in terms of why you're doing it. I don't show up and say, listen, look, you shouldn't put this in the cloud. It's you shouldn't put this in the cloud because of this and this reason. So that's going to be 10 more $1,000 a week you're going to have to spend if you make this cloud decision. And so I would recommend that you put it on a co-location provider. But by the way, it would work just as well on a co-location provider as it would in the cloud. Just one's going to cost you $10,000 more a week. What do you want to do? That's the decision. Well, I know what I want to do. I want to leave it, put it on the co-location provider and spend less money. But you have to kind of look at it with those sorts of ways. But I never show up pushing back on cloud in general because that's dumb. Because I don't know if cloud's a fit for them or not. It's a technology, and technologies don't know what the business problem is they're looking to solve. Good people have to make that happen. And I think that's where we're losing it now. The technology unto itself is not a strategy.
Last question for you, David. Do you think is there anything out there at the moment which is underhyped?
Boy, that's a great question, by the way. I think edge computing kind of went through a hype shift, and it's underhyped now. In other words, I think if many of these AI systems are going to function at the edge and not necessarily in these huge data centers, that are saturated with GPUs that we're building everywhere around here. And I think looking at that as an architectural option is something that people are missing. It's normally something I have to recommend. And they go, oh, yeah, the edge computing stuff. That was a big deal a couple of years ago, wasn't it? Yeah. And we kind of missed it after a while because AI took over and everybody's been focused on that. And if we're going to do AI, people are saying, well, it's going to have to be on big, intensive GPU based systems that lives in a data center. Not necessarily the case.
Fab. David, where would you most like people to come find you and follow your work?
Yeah, I have two YouTube channels, the Cloud Computing Insider. We had about 300,000 subscribers there. Also, Dave Linthicum is not AI, skeptic and expert. And that can be found out as well, or just find me on LinkedIn. Just type in my name. There's not too many Dave Linthicums around. I'll come up first.
Great pleasure having you on the Deck Show. Thanks so much for coming on, Dave.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's Deck Show. We'll be back next week. And if you don't already, be sure to follow the show so you don't miss an episode. Until next time.